Okay, ever feel like you're talking to a brick wall? Like, no matter how clearly you think you're explaining something, the other person just isn't getting it.
Oh, yeah, that's a universal struggle, isn't it? We've all been there.
Big time. And that's exactly why I'm so excited for today's deep dive. We're going to get into Bento C. Leal III's book, Four Essential Keys to Effective Communication.
Excellent choice.
It's not just another self-help book. It really gets down to brass tacks, giving you practical, actionable steps to improve your communication skills, which honestly, who couldn't use a little boost in that department, right?
I think one of the things that struck me most about Leal's approach is he doesn't just jump into a bunch of techniques. He starts with this concept of what he calls empathic awareness.
Empathic awareness. I like the sound of that already.
It's really about recognizing the inherent worth of both yourself and the other person in the interaction.
So it's deeper than just being like nice to each other. It's a whole mindset shift.
Exactly. It's a skill you can develop. And even has these little exercises you can do, like before a tough conversation, take 5 minutes, actually write down the other person's perspective.
Oh, that's a good one.
It forces you to step outside your own head, you know? Consider their viewpoint, even if you don't agree with it.
Love that, like a mental reset button. Although I will admit, sometimes it's hard to access that empathy, especially when someone's really pushing your buttons?
Totally get that. We've
Yeah.
all been there. But that's where this other key concept comes in, empathic listening. And Leal totally called me out on this one, I got to admit.
What do you mean?
Well, I realized I often get so focused on like what I'm going to say next that I'm not truly absorbing what the other person is actually saying.
Oh, I feel so seen right now. It's like you're waiting for your turn to talk instead of really listening.
Exactly. And that's the opposite of empathic listening.
So how do we break that habit? Like, how do we actually become better empathic listeners?
Well, Leal has this 5-step process, right? It all starts with quieting your mind. So like those mental distractions, you gotta silence them, really focus on the person speaking.
I mean, easier said than done, but
Totally, totally. But with practice, it gets easier, I promise. And then the next step is you got to listen openly, without judgment. None of that inner critic commentary.
so no jumping to conclusions before they even finish their sentence.
Exactly. You're not listening to reply. You're listening to understand.
No, it's good.
Then you got to listen through the words, right? Not just the surface level. What's the deeper meaning? What emotions are they conveying? I, of course, don't interrupt. Let them finish their thought.
Ugh, that one's hard for me.
It's a muscle we all have to flex, you know?
Yeah.
And then finally, once they're done speaking, you got to reflect back what you heard. Do your own words just summarize it?
It shows you were paying attention.
Right. And it gives them a chance to clarify if you missed anything.
So it's all about making the other person feel heard and understood.
100%.
Okay, all of that makes total sense for when we're the ones listening. But what about when it's our turn to speak? How do we ensure we're being heard and understood? Because
Yeah.
that's the other half of the equation, right?
Absolutely. And Leal's got us covered there, too. He talks about empathic speaking. And one of the big tools he gives us is something called the I statement.
I statement. Okay, tell me more.
Instead of using those blaming you statements,
Like you always or you never.
yeah, you shift your language to these ownership-focused I statements.
So instead of you're always late, it's I feel anxious when you're late.
Bingo. And what's crazy is just by changing that one word, you, to I, it changes the whole dynamic.
Less accusatory.
Exactly. You're taking responsibility for your own experience, which makes the other person less likely to get defensive.
Yeah.
It's not just about being polite. It's about fostering understanding.
That makes so much sense. You're flipping the script from blame to like shared responsibility.
And honestly, it increases the chances of the other person actually hearing what you're trying to communicate. Such a small tweak, but massive impact.
This is going in my mental toolbox for sure, though I have a feeling it's way harder than it sounds to actually implement.
You know, I tried this whole I statement thing with my partner, and it was harder than it sounded, but I stuck with it. And honestly, it's made a huge difference in how we communicate.
That's good to know. Okay, so we've got empathic listening and I statements, but what are some other key takeaways from four essential keys? There's got to be more gold in there, right?
Oh, there's tons. One that really resonated with me is the importance of expressing appreciation. Leo calls it the 3 A's: applaud, admire, appreciate.
I like that. It sounds super simple, but probably really powerful.
It is. Think about it. When was the last time someone genuinely expressed appreciation to you? How did that make you feel?
Honestly, world of difference. You feel seen, you feel valued, like you actually matter.
Exactly.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It's about those little things, those everyday moments.
Like telling your partner you appreciate them emptying the dishwasher, or telling a coworker you admire their work ethic.
Exactly. Don't just think it, say it out loud.
This is hitting home for me because I think we get so caught up in what's going wrong in our communication, we forget to acknowledge what's going right.
Right. It's so easy to focus on the negative.
Totally. So, on that note, I think it's a good time to take a little break and then we'll come back and dive into even more juicy communication goodness. Welcome back to our deep dive on effective communication. It's all about taking those relationships to the next level, one good conversation at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And, we've covered a lot of ground already with empathic awareness and empathic listening, that kind of foundation.
Yeah, the bedrock, for sure.
But there is still some, sneaky little communication pitfalls we can fall into,
Yeah.
even with the best intention.
Oh, totally. It's
Yeah.
like walking through a conversational minefield out there
And
sometimes.
right. And Leo points out some of these really subtle ones we might not even realize we're doing.
Okay, so, spill the tea. What are we doing wrong?
He calls them listening blocks, and they're so sneaky because you think you're listening, but your mind is actually off doing something else.
Oh my gosh, yes. I am so guilty of this.
I think we all are to some extent. And he has different categories of these listening blocks, right? One of the most common ones is mind reading.
Mind reading.
Yeah, it's when you think you already know what the other person's going to say, so you just kind of tune them out.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Been there, done that, heard it all before.
Exactly. But here's the thing. You might be missing some crucial details, some nuance, by assuming you know what's coming next.
You're just waiting for your turn to talk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's rehearsing, which is when you're so busy thinking about what you're going to say next, you're not even really present for what they're saying in the moment.
It's like you're having two conversations at the same time, the real one and the one in your head.
And then, of course, filtering, where you basically just hear what you want to hear and conveniently ignore anything that makes you uncomfortable.
Oh, that's a tough one. It's like you're creating your own version of the conversation.
Yeah, totally. And then, there are the more obvious ones like daydreaming, where you're just completely checked out, or advising, where you jump in with solutions before the person's even finished describing the problem.
Oh, that's me. Classic fixer right here. Always trying to solve everyone's problems for them.
Well, it comes from a good place, I'm sure, but it can be a listening block because you're not giving the other person the space to fully express themselves.
Right. Instead of actually listening, you're jumping ahead to conclusions and offering unsolicited advice.
Yeah, and sometimes people just need a vent. They just need to be heard and understood. They don't necessarily want a solution.
That's true. Okay, so those are some of the more active listening blocks. What about the more subtle ones?
Well, there's judging, right? When you're silently critiquing the person as they're speaking instead of really trying to understand their perspective.
Oh, yeah. Turning every conversation into a courtroom drama.
Right. And then there's condescending, that classic one-upper who always has to make the conversation about themselves.
Oh, ugh, we all know that person.
Yeah, it can be such a conversation killer because it makes the other person feel unheard and unimportant.
Okay, so we've identified all these sneaky listening blocks, but how do we actually, dismantle them?
Well, Leal has this great mantra: pause, reflect, adjust, act.
Ooh, I like that. It's like a mental reset button.
Yeah, exactly. So you catch yourself doing one of these listening blocks, hit pause, take a breath, remind yourself to listen with empathy.
Okay, so pause, reflect, adjust, act. I'm writing this down. But practically speaking, how do we actually cultivate that deep listening?
Well, it goes back to that 5-step process we discussed earlier, remember. Quiet your mind, listen openly, listen through the words, don't interrupt, and then reflect back.
Right, but I have a feeling it's more than just memorizing the step.
You're absolutely right. It takes, practice, conscious effort,
Yeah.
willingness to challenge those old habits.
So it's not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it.
100%. And Leal is really clear about this. There's a big difference between genuinely listening to understand versus just waiting for your turn to talk.
Oh, that's so true. I think we've all been there, myself included.
The goal of empathic listening is not to formulate your rebuttal or come up with the perfect solution.
It's about connecting with the other person, even if you don't agree with everything they're saying.
And it's amazing? A lot of times, just by being a good listener, you can actually help the person work through their own stuff.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they might even come up with their own solutions.
Yeah, it's like you're providing that safe space for them to just process things out loud.
Exactly. Sometimes, all someone needs is a sounding board. Someone who'll truly listen without judgment. And by doing that, you're actually empowering them to solve their own problems.
That's so powerful. I've totally experienced that. Like when a friend's venting about something and I just listen and reflect back their feelings, a lot of times they figure it out on their own.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it just highlights how empathic listening isn't just about being a good friend or partner. It's actually a powerful tool for personal growth and problem solving.
Okay, so we've mastered the art of listening, but what about speaking? How do we express ourselves in a way that's clear, respectful, and increases the chances of actually being heard? Because that's the other half of this whole communication equation, right?
Right, so get ready to level up your communication skills because Leal has got us covered on that too. He calls it empathic speaking, and it's about crafting your message with intention and, you guessed it, empathy.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the secret sauce?
Well, the first step is to actually clarify and organize your thoughts before you even open your mouth.
Wait, so you're telling me to think before I speak? Revolutionary.
I know, right? But it's so important. And he actually has this saying. He says, if you blurt, you could hurt.
Oof, ain't that the truth? Especially when you're feeling emotional.
Yeah, it's so easy to just blurt out the first thing that pops into your head, but that often leads to miscommunication and hurt feelings. So
Mm.
instead, just take a moment, pause, breathe, and really think about what you want to say and how you want to say it.
So it's about being intentional with our words, even, or maybe especially, when we're feeling overwhelmed with emotions.
Exactly. And this is where those I statements can be really helpful.
Right? Instead of saying, you never listen to me,
Mm,
you say, I feel unheard when this happens.
Perfect example. I statements are like a magic formula for expressing your feelings and needs without putting the other person on the defensive. Because let's be honest, nobody likes to feel attacked or blamed.
Right.
And when someone feels attacked, they're much less likely to actually hear what you're trying to say.
So I statements increase the chances of our message actually getting through.
It's like you're speaking a language that everyone can understand.
Okay, so we've got our thoughts organized, we're using I statements, but what about delivery? Because sometimes it's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
That's a great point. And that's where step 2 of empathic speaking comes in. Express with respect. So choose your words carefully. Be mindful of your tone of voice,
Even when you're talking about like tough stuff.
especially when you're talking about tough stuff. Remember, you're interacting with another human being who deserves respect, even if you disagree with them.
So it's not about being a pushover. It's about treating the other person with dignity, even in the midst of a conflict.
Absolutely. It's about creating that safe space for dialogue, even when it's challenging.
And it's not just about our words, right? It's about tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, all that nonverbal stuff.
You're so right. Make sure all of those nonverbal cues are aligned with your words.
So we're speaking with respect, we're using I statements, but sometimes, even with all that, our message still gets lost in translation. It happens.
It does happen. And that's where step 3 of empathic speaking comes in. Express your points clearly.
Don't make them play a guessing game.
Exactly. Don't expect the other person to read your mind. Clearly articulate what you want, what you need, how you feel.
And don't try to cram like 5 different points into one sentence.
Right. One issue at a time. Break things down into bite-sized pieces.
And then,
Pause.
that's step 4. Give the other person a chance to respond, to process what you just said.
Don't just keep steamrolling through the conversation.
Exactly. And if they seem hesitant or confused, you can gently prompt them. You're like, what did you understand from what I just said? Or what are your thoughts on this?
And then, this is the most important part, actually listen to their response.
I know, it's so easy to forget that step.
Right. We're so focused on getting our point across, we don't really make space for the other person's perspective.
But remember, communication is a two-way street. It's a dance, not a monologue. I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored those sneaky listening blocks and learned some really powerful tools for speaking with empathy. What's next?
Well, there's still more to discover.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this incredible journey with Bento C. Leal III's 4 essential keys to effective communication, learning all sorts of tools to really level up our communication game.
You know, it's one thing to read about these things, right? But putting them into practice, that's where the real magic happens.
Totally. It's like, how do we go from fumbling newbies to like communication ninjas? How do we make these skills actually stick?
Well, Moskis, Leal's a big believer in practice.
Makes sense. You don't become a master chef just by reading cookbooks.
Exactly. He even has this saying, practice makes permanent. Not perfect, permanent.
Oh, I like that.
Because, if you practice the wrong way, you just get really good at doing it wrong.
Ooh, that's a good point. I've never thought about it like that.
It's like, that saying, practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. So we have to be really mindful about how we practice, making sure we're using the skills correctly and consistently.
Okay, so we need to practice. But where do we even start? Does Leal give us any guidance on that?
He does. He actually lays out this really cool 12-day communication challenge.
Oh, a challenge. I love a challenge. What's that all about?
So it's basically a step-by-step plan for incorporating these skills into your daily life, one day at a time.
So each day has a different focus.
Exactly. It starts with building that foundation of empathic awareness, recognizing your own value and the value of the other person, which, honestly, we could all use a little more of these days.
Absolutely.
And then it moves into practicing empathic listening, like we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Quieting your mind, listening through the words, reflecting back what you hear. Then it shifts to those empathic speaking skills, using I statements, expressing yourself with respect, being super clear about your points. And what I love about this challenge is it really breaks down what can feel like a really overwhelming task into these bite-sized pieces.
So you're not trying to do everything at once. It's about making small, consistent changes over time.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle. You start with lighter weights and you gradually increase the intensity as you get stronger.
I imagine having that structured plan is really helpful, like a roadmap.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
takes the guesswork out of it.
Okay, I'm sold on the 12-day challenge. But what about, like, after those 12 days are over? How do we make sure we don't just slip back into those old bad habits?
That's a great question. And Leal actually addresses that in the book.
Mm.
He emphasizes that even if you stumble along the way, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it.
We're all human, mistakes happen.
Exactly. Just acknowledge the slip-up, review the skill, and get back on track.
Maybe even use an I statement to communicate how you feel about the whole thing?
There you go. Now, Leal also provides some really great advice on how to, maintain these skills once you've learned them.
Because it's not like you just graduate from communication school and you're done.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
Right. It's like any skill. You have to keep practicing to stay sharp.
So what's the secret to keeping those communication muscles toned?
Well, he uses this brilliant analogy. He says relationships are like gardens. They need constant tending, not just the initial planting.
I love that. It really speaks to that idea that relationships take effort.
Exactly. It's not enough to just have one good conversation and call it a day. You have to actively nurture that connection, just like you would a garden.
So how do we tend to our relationship gardens, so to speak?
Well, I think it starts with being mindful.
Yeah.
Intentional. Not just letting things slide or taking people for
Or
granted.
sewing up.
Yeah, exactly. Being present in those relationships. And sometimes it's just about those small acts of connection. A phone call, a handwritten note, a spontaneous coffee date.
Just little things to let the other person know you care.
Right. And remember those 3 A's we talked about before. Applaud, admire, appreciate.
Those are like miracle grow for your relationship garden.
They really are. Make a point of expressing those things regularly. It can make a huge difference.
Don't wait for a special occasion.
Exactly. Just sprinkle those in throughout your day-to-day interactions.
And you know what? It feels good to do it. Like, expressing that appreciation, it actually boosts your own well-being too, not just the recipient.
It's a win-win.
Yeah.
Giving and receiving appreciation, it creates this positive feedback loop that nourishes both people in the relationship.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into effective communication, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I love it.
Communication is a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, growing, and adapting.
That is such a great point.
It's not about reaching some perfect state of communication, but about embracing that process of growth and connection.
Beautifully said.
And the more we embrace that growth mindset, I truly believe the more fulfilling and meaningful our relationships will become.
I agree.
So keep practicing those skills, keep tending to your relationship gardens, and never stop learning.
It's been such a pleasure joining you on this deep dive.
Thank you for all of your insights. This has been incredibly enlightening.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.